So it's been a week since I did my unboxing for the TCL 30XE 5G. I've been using this thing a decent amount, and I think it's time to publish a full review of this device. If you haven't seen the unboxing, definitely go check that out. Link to that will be in the description. But to start off this review, let's do a quick look around the hardware of the device first. So going around this device, we have a glass front, plastic everywhere else, and it's a decent feeling plastic. It's a plastic that I actually looked up to confirm was plastic, and that might be silly. Some of you will probably feel this and pretty easily be able to determine that this is in fact plastic, but it feels pretty decent. It does have the rear mounted fingerprint scanner back there, and then you will see a triple set of cameras here on the back. We will talk about those cameras quite a bit more here as we go on, as well as the LED flash there. Up top, we do have a 3.5mm headphone jack, something that a lot of people definitely do love seeing. On the bottom, we have the only two speakers that we do have available, as well as the USB-C port. On this side here, you do have your SIM tray, which does have an SD card slot for expansion, which is a great thing to have, as well as 64 gigs on board, and then your micro SD slot there if you want to expand it. The entire device itself is about 195 grams, which isn't all that heavy. It sits about 9 millimeters in thickness, which isn't all that thick. The screen is a 6.52-inch display running at 720 by 1600, which I believe is like 720p. Of course it is. 720 is in the name. Duh. Which is interrupted at the top by a little notch, a teeny tiny little notch, and then a relatively sizable chin down at the bottom. Personally, I would have rather seen this thing just be symmetrical, get rid of the notch and just bring that down. Symmetry would have looked better in my opinion, but I don't think it looks too bad all in all. As far as the onboard internals here, we do have 4 gigs of RAM, a 4500 milliamp hour battery, and then powering this device is a little bit of a different thing from what we're used to seeing. It is a MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. This thing is not going to be super duper powerful, but I think it's more than punchy enough to be able to do what most people are going to need to do, as well as some gaming, which I will touch on in a little bit. Generally speaking, the appearance of this thing is really understated. I mean, it's just black. It's really kind of nondescript. Definitely not a looker, but it's not ugly either. When we jump into the software, it's honestly pretty basic. Their stock launcher reminds me of pretty much stock Android. When you jump into the settings here, it's going to look again like pretty much stock Android settings with a few things here added in, a few added benefits. But they've really not done a whole lot to the software. One of my favorite added benefits, though, would be this one. So on any Android device, if you swipe up and hold, you're going to get your multitasking view, right? And that's totally true of this device as well. However, on this device, you can swipe up and take it up to a corner to go straight into split view like this. And then you get a cool little selection of options you can do here where you can switch things around, or you can open up an app drawer to change the app. You can maximize an app or what have you. But also, you can swipe up and go over to this side and you can get this app in a floating window. And then you can run anything else you would like behind it. And both of these things work pretty well. And as you can see, that Dimensity 700 processor, 4 gigs of RAM, I think this thing's going to be slow. But as I jump around through this device, you'll find that everything loads relatively quickly. You're not going to be sitting here waiting on a lot of things. Android devices nowadays are so much more powerful than they really need to be, that even this Dimensity 700 processor is going to do a pretty good job. Now, there are a few quirks though, right? When I was customizing my home screen here, I noticed something very odd. When I wanted to long press, and let's say I'm going to put Gmail on my desktop, you would long press it and you're looking for where you would want to go to bring it to the desktop, and it just doesn't want to do it. It just doesn't want to go onto the desktop. And I was very confused by this. Now, to make matters even stranger, let's say I make a folder here, because there were some folders to begin with. There's some Google folders. If I did that one, it would take it straight to the desktop. And I kept thinking to myself, what on earth is going on here? And then just totally randomly, what I did, let me get rid of this folder, was I long pressed and then I didn't move. And that brought it over. So for some reason, there are two different behaviors to add in a folder to your desktop versus adding a single application to your desktop. That is weird. That is strange. I don't know why that is like that. Something else I'm also experiencing with some regularity, we'll see if this is something that can be replicated here, is that I will swipe up to go home and I will somehow trigger the swipe up and hold multitasking. You saw how quickly I did that. I didn't swipe up and hold in the normal sense like that. I just kind of swiped up. It's a little bit too narrow. I think that gesture is too narrow. It's too easy to trigger, and that was happening to me quite a bit. And one more quirk that isn't necessarily a problem of just TCL, it can be a problem with other devices too. If you install a third-party launcher, you may be stuck using the 3-button navigation instead of gestures. And I tried to use some different applications using ADB to enable gestures, and they just didn't want to work very well for me. So I wound up being stuck with the stock launcher. Luckily, the stock launcher seems to be okay. I wish there were some more settings in here. You can kind of get an idea here of exactly what you have. There's not a ton, so that might be a bit annoying to you. Maybe there will be a workaround for that as time goes on to do a third-party launcher and still have gesture navigation. But for now, that does seem to be the case. One of the benefits, though, of using something like a Dimensity 700 processor, something that's a little bit less powerful, is that it also uses less power. And when you couple that with a 720p screen, something that also, I believe, only has a PPI of a little over 200, so like 200, and I think it's like maybe 13 pixels per inch, whereas something like Surface Duo 2 is more like 400 PPI, that's going to use a lot less power too. And because of that, I'm routinely seeing 6+ hours of screen on time for this thing. This thing is pretty hard to kill. This is definitely an all-day, no charge necessary phone in my experience. Of course, if you want to start doing some heavy gaming, lots of photography, lots of videos, things like that, of course you can kill the battery. But normal use, this thing seems to be quite decent on battery. Now, when we're talking about the screen here, this is not the best screen I've ever seen. And that being said, we do have to very much keep in mind, this is a $200 phone, and if you're setting up a new line on T-Mobile, it is a free phone. So we have to keep our expectations kind of in check for what this thing is. But the screen is not phenomenal, okay? It is only 200 and something PPI. It is only 720p, so there is a little bit of graininess. But for that price, for that entry point, you're not a tech person, you're buying this phone for your kid or something like that. Is this screen going to be really good and really large as well? Absolutely, it's going to be good enough for the average person. Now, one place that I think is maybe a little bit weaker than I would like it to be is with the speakers. You get a single mono setup here. You've got 2 speaker grills down here, and it's possible sounds coming out of both of them, sure, but the things just don't sound very good. They don't get very loud, and they're pretty tinny. Let me give you an example here. As we let this play here very briefly. It gets very distorted at max volume. You're getting a lot of staticky, crackling things going on. The sound in general on something like this just really doesn't sound great. And if we compare it to something like Duo 2, which is not known for having a phenomenal set of speakers, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. You're going to immediately notice a lot more bass, a lot more clarity, and way less distortion than you're getting on this phone here. But that being said, this is still a 6.52-inch screen, so consuming media of any sort is going to be pretty decent on it. That is a pretty large canvas, so maybe you can get past the 720p, maybe you can get past the slightly tinny, slightly distorted sounding speakers at times and still have a pretty good experience consuming media on this device. Now, I talked about gaming, and I've not done a ton of testing in terms of gaming on this thing because, unfortunately, I just lost all of my ROMs because I'm an idiot and I got to get all my ROMs again. So currently, I just tested the biggest Android game that I know of, but one that does seem to be a pretty good rubric to see if an Android phone is going to be able to game very well, and that is PUBG Mobile. So this is actually a recording from this device. I was playing it and recording it at the same time with the built-in recorder, and you can see here, it is running absolutely flawlessly. I'm panning around the plane as I'm flying overhead, nary a stutter, no problems at all as I begin to parachute. Again, totally smooth. Draw distance is pretty normal for a phone like this, and honestly, pretty solid experience. Even as I land, sometimes you get those big stutters. There's a little bit of a stutter, but not too bad at all. This thing handled PUBG Mobile very, very well. As I go on here, I'm running around, I'm looting, and this thing, like I keep saying, is performing pretty admirably. Now, maybe you're going to want to take advantage of your headphones because you just have that one mono speaker, so you might have a hard time hearing someone coming, like I managed to do here just by total happenstance. I could see gaming on this thing being okay. It's a big screen. The speakers aren't great, but there's a headphone jack, so plug those headphones in, and you could totally game on this thing. And as I've said before, $200, free with a new line. This could be the phone you're giving your kid. So you have to think about, is this a phone that a kid might enjoy? It's made of plastic. It's not super duper expensive, and it's got stuff that would make it a pretty decent gaming device. So I've covered a lot here already, but we need to cover the cameras. So you have a 12 megapixel primary camera, you have a 2 megapixel macro, and you have a 2 megapixel depth sensor that I'm assuming they're using for things like portrait mode. So I've taken some pictures here, some samples I can show you. So let's go over those here now. So this first one here is going to be using that macro sensor. I like macro photography. I love getting up really close to stuff and seeing intricate details. So I went around and I took some macro photos. You can see here, this is a 2 megapixel picture. I can't zoom in very far. You can see that I'm up pretty close to this thing, but it's a 2 megapixel photo. I'm not sure how great this really is because it's just not very sharp. 2 megapixels. And then by comparison, this is the 12 megapixel. This is the primary. So you can see how much closer I was able to get, but I almost feel like I could zoom in on the 12 megapixel and have maybe just as much, if not more, detail retained than on the 2 megapixel. It's just such a low resolution image. Here's an image of my koi pond. We're just coming out of fall. We're heading into spring. I need to clean the thing up a bit, but you can kind of see here the colors are a little bit muted. Detail isn't the most incredible I've ever seen. There's some weird like doubling going on up here on the edges as well. I don't think I was really moving very much, but things are a little odd on the fringes, but overall, it's a passable image. Using portrait mode, here's my boy Rutherford, and I think this is a pretty decent picture. The details up here up front are relatively nice and crisp. He's a little bit under detailed here in the shadows, but the focus fall off is pretty good. Hopefully that depth sensor is doing its job here as the focus falls away. It's a pretty decent portrait. Here's a picture of Copper here in the living room. This is inside and it's relatively well lit. As we zoom in, you can see the details are not great. You pretty much have no individual fur separation, individual hair. Is what it is. Not phenomenal. Here's a dandelion, again with the macro image, zoomed in really nice and close. This is a pretty cool looking picture. You can really see some up close details. Here is a honeybee that I managed to see, maybe the first bee of the year. Pretty cool, but again, this looks like a picture taken on an old webcam or something. It just has that kind of faded out look to it. It doesn't look super great. I wish the macro sensor was better because I really wanted to use it a lot, but the image quality just isn't that great, and I can illustrate this a bit further like this. So here is this dandelion. Well, here's a picture I took with my Surface Duo 2, and then I just cropped in. Which image to you is the more pleasing image? I mean, maybe the angling was better on this one, but I feel like I'm getting just about as much detail and way better color representation, way better focus fall off, just zooming in on a normal shot from a different phone than with this macro. In terms of video, it's about what you'd expect. It's passable for certain situations, but the EIS, the electronic image stabilization, is not great. It bounces around quite a bit. Colors look a little bit washed out. Details aren't phenomenal, but again, 12 megapixel camera on a presumably free or $200 phone. It's about what you would expect. And I think that's pretty much the story of the camera system on this device. Personally, I mean, I wish that they had just taken out that 2 megapixel macro and replaced it with literally anything else. An ultra wide, a telephoto. 2 megapixels is just not good enough to do anything of use. Even though it's cool to be able to get up nice and close on something like this, it is just such a not sharp image. It is so washed out looking that I can't imagine even posting this thing anywhere. Now, the best thing about the camera setup is that it's very responsive. The camera launches quickly and there is no shutter lag. It snaps the pictures very, very quickly, but the quality is just not phenomenal. Now, for a cheap phone, as cheap as this phone is this going to get you by? Is this going to be as good as anything you're going to go into Walmart and buy on a prepaid? Oh, it'll be better than those for sure. So in that regard, I think the camera setup is a win. When you compare it to something that it's not meant to be compared to, it's not going to look great. But if you compare it to the things it's meant to be compared to, other cheaper phones in this general vicinity, I think the camera setup holds up relatively well, even if the 2 megapixel macro is a bit of a letdown. So there you go. Overall, I think this is a really solid phone. If this is something you're looking at potentially getting for free from T-Mobile when you're signing up, I don't think you're going to go wrong with this thing. I think it's pretty solid. You've got that really big screen. You've got a fast fingerprint scanner. You have a very fast camera, which for a lot of people, that speed is going to make up for some of that quality. You've got really solid battery life, decently fast charging, which I believe is 18 watts if I didn't mention that. All in all, you've got a phone that just a few short years ago would have been $500 or $600. Today, $200 is where it's at. Thanks to TCL for sending this review unit over for me. I had a lot of fun testing it. Hopefully this video will be useful to some of you guys and gals out there looking at your next smartphone. Maybe you're switching to T-Mobile or what have you. I'll see you on the next video, guys. And until then, stay nerdy, my friends.